Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night with your heart racing and your mind filled with worries that seem to come from nowhere? That moment when the concerns of life suddenly feel overwhelming, and your peace shatters like glass hitting concrete. You lay there in the darkness wondering why your faith, which felt so strong during the day, now seems so fragile in these quiet hours. Perhaps you've experienced that sense of wrestling, not just with anxious thoughts, but with something deeper, something that feels like a battle for your very soul. This experience is not just a psychological phenomenon, but a spiritual reality that Saint Ignatius of Loyola recognized centuries ago when he observed that those who sleep with faith wake up in spiritual battle. This profound insight into the nature of our spiritual journey reveals something crucial about authentic faith. It is not merely a comfort, but a call to vigilance, a summons to recognize the constant spiritual warfare that surrounds us even in our most peaceful moments. The spiritual life, according to Ignatius, is not a gentle stroll through flowery meadows, but rather a battlefield where forces beyond our physical perception contend for influence over our choices, our affections, and ultimately our eternal destiny. This understanding might seem jarring in our modern world where spirituality is often packaged as a path to inner peace and personal fulfillment. Yet there is something deeply authentic and liberating in acknowledging this reality of spiritual combat. It explains the inexplicable tensions we feel in our souls, the mysterious resistance we encounter when pursuing virtue, and the subtle temptations that arrive precisely when our resolve for good seems strongest. Imagine for a moment the experience of Ignatius himself. Before his conversion, he was a proud Spanish nobleman and soldier, filled with dreams of worldly glory and romantic conquests. Wounded in battle at Pamplona, his leg shattered by a cannonball, he was forced into a lengthy convalescence at his family home. During this time of physical healing with nothing but saints' lives and the life of Christ to read, Ignatius began to notice something remarkable happening within his consciousness. When he would daydream about returning to his former life of worldly ambition and romantic pursuits, he would feel an immediate pleasure that would quickly fade, leaving him dry and discontented. But when he would contemplate imitating the saints and serving Christ, he would experience an initial resistance, followed by a deep and lasting peace. In this simple observation lay the seeds of what would become his revolutionary understanding of spiritual discernment. Ignatius realized that there were distinct spiritual forces at work within the human heart and mind, often operating beneath our conscious awareness. These forces he would later identify as coming from what he called different spirits: the good spirit which leads toward God, and the enemy spirit which subtly pulls us away from our divine purpose. The battlefield was not primarily external, but internal, located in the hidden chambers of human consciousness, where our most significant choices begin to form. This insight transformed Ignatius from a vain courtier into one of the most influential spiritual masters in Christian history. The awareness of spiritual battle became not a cause for fear, but the foundation for a new kind of spiritual freedom. By recognizing these interior movements and learning to discern their sources, Ignatius discovered that we can cooperate more fully with divine grace and resist the subtle deceptions that would lead us astray. The spiritual exercises. His masterwork of spiritual psychology provides a systematic method for engaging in this interior combat, with wisdom, vigilance, and ultimate success. But what does this spiritual battle look like in our everyday lives? It rarely announces itself with dramatic signs or obvious temptations. More often, it operates in the subtle realm of thoughts, feelings, attractions, and aversions. Consider how often you've set out with firm intention to grow in patience, kindness, or generosity, only to find yourself inexplicably irritable, judgmental, or selfish shortly afterward. Or reflect on those moments when your prayer life, which had been flourishing, suddenly feels dry and pointless for no apparent reason. These experiences, which we might attribute to mere mood swings or psychological factors, Ignatius would recognize as evidence of spiritual warfare. The enemy of our spiritual progress, according to Ignatian insight, works with remarkable subtlety. This adversary studies our particular vulnerabilities and customizes temptations accordingly. For the person inclined toward pride, the temptation might come in the form of spiritual superiority, looking down on others who seem less devout or knowledgeable. For someone struggling with scrupulosity, the attack might involve overwhelming feelings of unworthiness and excessive focus on minor faults. The one given to sensual pleasures might be tempted through increasingly powerful attractions to comfort and gratification. In each case, the strategy is tailored to the individual's specific weakness. I'd like to pause for a moment here and ask you something important. Have you noticed these patterns in your own spiritual life? Those moments when your best intentions suddenly face mysterious resistance? When your clearest spiritual insights become clouded by doubt, or when your most sincere prayers feel blocked by an invisible barrier? If this resonates with your experience, I invite you to share it in the comments. You can simply write, "I recognize this spiritual battle," and if you feel comfortable, briefly describe what this battle looks like in your life. Your honesty might be exactly what someone else needs to read today, to recognize their own spiritual struggle. Sometimes acknowledging that we are in a battle is the first step toward engaging it effectively with the wisdom that Saint Ignatius offers us. The most dangerous aspect of this spiritual combat is that many of us remain unaware it is happening at all. We attribute our spiritual ups and downs entirely to psychological factors, cultural influences, or random chance. While these elements certainly play their role, Ignatius would urge us to see beyond them to the deeper spiritual dynamics at work. Without this awareness, we fight blindfolded, unable to distinguish friend from foe, or to employ the spiritual weapons available to us. This blindness is itself a tactical victory for the forces opposing our spiritual growth. To better understand these dynamics, Ignatius offers us his famous rules for discernment, which provide remarkable insight into the typical patterns of spiritual warfare. When a person is moving away from God, the good spirit typically acts by creating feelings of remorse, unease, and healthy guilt that invite conversion. Meanwhile, the enemy spirit offers comforting rationalizations, false peace, and justifications for continuing in destructive patterns. Conversely, when someone is sincerely pursuing spiritual growth, the good spirit provides genuine consolation, peace, and courage, while the enemy attacks through discouragement, confusion, anxiety, and the magnification of difficulties. Consider how these patterns might appear in contemporary life. A person who has been neglecting their spiritual commitments might feel a growing sense of emptiness and dissatisfaction, nudging them back toward prayer and faith community. This unease, which feels uncomfortable, is actually the action of grace. Simultaneously, they might hear internal whispers suggesting, "You're too busy right now," or "You deserve a break from spiritual obligations." Messages that offer immediate relief, but lead to deeper spiritual disengagement. Recognizing these contrary movements and their sources is essential for making free and conscious spiritual choices. Conversely, someone actively growing in faith might experience profound peace and enthusiasm in their spiritual practices, only to be suddenly assaulted by doubts about whether their efforts matter or whether God is even listening. These painful experiences, which feel like spiritual failure, may actually be evidence of spiritual progress, since the opposition intensifies precisely when real growth is occurring. Ignatius would counsel not discouragement, but increased vigilance in such moments, preparing for what he calls spiritual desolation, as a normal and even predictable part of the spiritual journey. What makes Ignatian spirituality so practical and enduring is that it doesn't merely identify the problem of spiritual combat, but offers concrete strategies for engaging in it successfully. The first, and perhaps most important of these strategies, is the practice of the exam, a daily review of consciousness that helps us recognize the subtle movements of different spirits in our experience. By taking time each day to reflect on where we have felt drawn toward or away from God, we develop spiritual sensitivity and discernment. We begin to recognize patterns in our interior life and understand our personal vulnerabilities more clearly. Another crucial Ignatian practice is meditation on sacred scripture, particularly through what he called contemplation, in which we use our imagination to enter into biblical scenes as participants rather than mere observers. This practice not only deepens our understanding of divine truths, but actually fortifies our spiritual perception, making us more resistant to deception. By regularly immersing ourselves in the authentic voice of God through Scripture, we become better able to distinguish that voice from counterfeit spiritual messages. Ignatius also emphasized the importance of spiritual direction and accountability. He recognized that we are often blind to our own spiritual condition and vulnerable to self-deception. By honestly sharing our interior experiences with a wise guide, we gain another perspective that can help us navigate the complexities of spiritual warfare. The enemy of our progress, Ignatius observed, prefers to work in darkness and isolation. Bringing our experiences into the light through candid spiritual conversation often diminishes their power over us. Perhaps most importantly, Ignatius taught that spiritual combat cannot be successfully engaged through human effort alone. Divine grace is absolutely essential, and is accessed primarily through prayer and sacramental life. Regular confession reception of the Eucharist and committed personal prayer are not merely devotional practices but vital channels of spiritual power. They connect us to resources beyond our natural capacity and enable us to stand firm in battles that would otherwise overwhelm us. One of the most powerful images that Ignatius offers us comes from his spiritual exercises in the meditation, known as the two standards. In this contemplation, participants are invited to imagine two great military camps on a battlefield. One camp is led by Christ, who gathers his followers under the standard or flag of humility, service, and authentic love. The opposing camp is led by the enemy of human nature, who attracts followers through false promises of wealth, honor, and pride. Each person must choose which standard to follow, which leader to serve. What makes this meditation so valuable is that it clarifies the fundamental options before us in spiritual life. The battle is ultimately not between pleasure and pain, or even between good and evil in the abstract, but between authentic and counterfeit versions of the good. The enemy rarely tempts spiritually aware people with obvious evil, but rather with distortions of good things that lead subtly away from God. Wealth, honor, and achievement are not inherently negative, but when pursued as ends in themselves rather than as means of serving God and others, they become spiritual traps. This insight from Ignatius connects with his famous principle of finding God in all things. The spiritual battle is not about rejecting the material world or natural human desires, but about ordering them properly with God at the center. When we recognize that everything in creation can either lead us toward or away from God depending on how we approach it, we develop a more nuanced understanding of spiritual combat. The battlefield extends to every aspect of human experience, from our careers to our relationships, from our use of technology to our leisure activities. Ignatius's own life illustrates this holistic approach to spiritual warfare. After his conversion, he did not withdraw from the world into isolated contemplation, though he did spend important periods in retreat and prayer. Instead, he founded a religious order, the Society of Jesus, that would engage actively with culture, education, politics, and social concerns. The Jesuits became known for their work in schools, universities, missions, and service to the marginalized, all while maintaining a profound interior life of prayer and discernment. This integration of contemplation and action, what Ignatius called being contemplatives in action, represents a mature response to the reality of spiritual battle. One of the most challenging aspects of spiritual warfare, as Ignatius understood it, is that it often intensifies rather than diminishes as we progress in spiritual life. Those who are making real advances in virtue, prayer, and service can expect stronger opposition, precisely because their growing influence threatens the powers of darkness. This counterintuitive reality can be discouraging if not properly understood. Many people assume that spiritual growth should lead to increasing ease and comfort, when in fact it often brings new and more subtle challenges. Ignatius prepares us for this reality through his teaching on the three kinds of humility, and what he calls the third degree of humility. The first degree involves basic obedience to divine law. The second means living in a state of spiritual freedom and detachment, not preferring wealth to poverty, honor to dishonor, a long life to a short one, except as these serve God's purposes. But the third degree of humility goes further. It involves actually preferring to be poor, rejected, and considered foolish for Christ's sake, when this choice allows greater imitation of Jesus and identification with his mission. This third degree of humility represents spiritual maturity and directly counters the enemy's primary weapons of pride, comfort-seeking, and fear of suffering. By embracing rather than fleeing the cross in its various forms, we confound the typical strategies used against us in spiritual warfare. The saints throughout history have demonstrated this paradoxical wisdom. Their willingness to endure misunderstanding, persecution, poverty, and even martyrdom for the sake of the gospel rendered ineffective the usual temptations that derail most spiritual journeys. How does this ancient wisdom about spiritual battle translate into practical guidance for our daily lives? First, it invites us to wake up to the reality that our spiritual journey matters enough to provoke opposition. The very fact that we encounter resistance in prayer service or moral choices can be seen as evidence of their significance. Rather than being discouraged by this opposition, we can recognize it as confirmation that we are moving in the right direction and threatening real spiritual strongholds. Second, Ignatius would counsel us to prepare for spiritual battle rather than being surprised by it. Just as a soldier trains during peacetime to be ready for combat, we can develop spiritual disciplines and habits that strengthen us for times of intense spiritual pressure. Regular prayer, scripture reading, participation in faith community, honest self-examination, and periodic retreats are not luxury items for the spiritually elite, but basic training for anyone serious about spiritual growth. The time to develop these habits is before crisis strikes, not during its most intense moments. Third, we can learn to recognize and respond appropriately to the specific tactics most often used against us personally. Ignatius emphasized that the enemy studies our particular weaknesses and customizes attacks accordingly. Some of us are more vulnerable to discouragement, others to pride, still others to sensual temptations or disordered attachments to people or things. By identifying our personal patterns of vulnerability, we can prepare specific defenses and responses. When we know where attacks are likely to come, we can fortify those areas in advance. Fourth, we can embrace the Ignatian practice of the agere contra, acting against our disordered tendencies. When we notice ourselves being pulled toward excessive self-protection, comfort-seeking, or pride, we can deliberately choose actions that move in the opposite direction. This might mean choosing to serve others when we feel entitled to be served, speaking truth when silence would be safer, or persevering in prayer precisely when it feels dry and pointless. These counterintuitive choices directly confront the enemy's typical strategies. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we can approach spiritual battle with confidence rather than fear. Ignatius reminds us that while the combat is real and the enemy formidable, we fight from a position of ultimate victory. The decisive battle has already been won through Christ's death and resurrection. Our skirmishes, however intense they may feel, take place within that larger context of assured divine triumph. This confidence allows us to engage spiritual warfare with courage, wisdom, and even a certain spiritual joy, knowing that our struggles have meaning and purpose within God's larger plan. This vision of spiritual life as battle might seem initially unappealing, especially in our comfort-seeking culture. Many of us would prefer a spirituality that promises only peace, tranquility, and self-actualization. Yet there is something in the Ignatian approach that resonates with our deeper intuitions about reality. We sense that anything truly valuable must be worth fighting for, that genuine growth involves struggle, and that the most meaningful achievements often come through confronting rather than avoiding difficulty. In acknowledging spiritual combat, Ignatius offers not a burden, but a more authentic and ultimately more satisfying approach to the spiritual journey. Moreover, this understanding of spiritual battle gives meaning and context to the difficulties we inevitably face. When we experience dryness in prayer, confusion in discernment, or resistance in pursuing virtue, we need not conclude that something has gone wrong or that God has abandoned us. Rather, these experiences can be recognized as normal, even expected aspects of the spiritual combat to which we have been called. They become opportunities for growth in spiritual maturity and deepening trust, rather than occasions for discouragement or despair. Consider how this perspective might transform your approach to persistent struggles in your life. Perhaps you've battled for years with a particular weakness, character flaw, or recurring sin pattern. You've prayed fervently for deliverance, sought counsel, confessed repeatedly, yet still find yourself engaged in the same fight. The Ignatian understanding of spiritual battle offers a different way to view this situation. Instead of seeing continued struggle as evidence of spiritual failure, you might recognize it as the particular arena in which you are called to engage most deeply in spiritual combat, developing virtues of perseverance, humility, and trust that could not be formed any other way. Or perhaps you've experienced the phenomenon of spiritual attacks, intensified opposition that seems to arrive precisely when you've made a new commitment to faith or taken steps toward greater service or devotion. From an Ignatian perspective, this timing is not coincidental but strategic. The forces opposed to your spiritual growth respond to perceived threats with increased activity. Rather than being discouraged by this opposition, you can view it as confirmation of the significance of your spiritual choices and prepare accordingly with increased prayer vigilance and support from spiritual companions. The Ignatian understanding of spiritual battle also helps make sense of the mysterious cycles of consolation and desolation that characterize most spiritual journeys. Times of spiritual dryness, darkness, and diminished fervor, which we might interpret as divine abandonment or personal failure, can instead be recognized as normal seasons in the ongoing spiritual combat. These periods of desolation, while painful, serve important purposes, helping us purify our motivations, test our commitment, and develop spiritual maturity that goes beyond emotional experiences. Ignatius provides specific guidance for navigating these challenging times. During spiritual desolation, he counsels us to avoid making major changes or decisions since our perception is compromised. Instead, we should intensify rather than abandon our spiritual practices, even if they feel mechanical or pointless. We should increase our patience with ourselves, recognizing that this trial has purpose and meaning. And we should remember previous experiences of consolation, trusting that the current darkness will eventually give way to renewed light and fervor. Just as importantly, Ignatius offers wisdom for times of spiritual consolation, those periods of enthusiasm, fervor, and emotional connection to God. These experiences, while genuine and valuable, can create their own spiritual dangers if not approached with discernment. During such times, we should give thanks for divine generosity, while recognizing that these feelings are gifts rather than achievements or evidence of spiritual superiority. We should store up the insights and resolutions formed during consolation, preparing for future times of struggle. And we should maintain humility, remembering that our capacity to remain faithful does not depend on emotional fervor, but on grace and committed will. The Ignatian approach to spiritual battle emphasizes not just defensive strategies against temptation, but positive offensive engagement through service mission and transformative action. The spiritual exercises culminate not in passive contemplation, but in a prayer known as the contemplatio ad amorem, or the contemplation to attain love. In this prayer, exercitants consider all that God has given them and respond with the famous Suscipe prayer. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will, all that I have and possess. You have given all to me, now I return it. All is yours, dispose of it wholly according to your will. Give me only your love and your grace, that is enough for me. This prayer represents the ultimate weapon in spiritual warfare, total surrender to divine love. By freely offering everything back to God, including our deepest attachments and most cherished possessions, we undermine the enemy's primary strategy, which involves fostering disordered attachments that quietly displace God from the center of our lives. This surrender paradoxically leads not to impoverishment, but to the ultimate freedom that Ignatius called indifference. The capacity to choose, based on what truly serves God and others, rather than on passing feelings or fears. The contemporary relevance of this Ignatian wisdom cannot be overstated. We live in a culture that bombards us with messages contrary to spiritual health and growth. Constant distraction, immediate gratification, superficial relationships, materialistic values, and relentless busyness characterize modern American life. These cultural patterns are not spiritually neutral, but actively work against the conditions needed for authentic faith development. Recognizing these influences as part of the spiritual battle helps us engage them consciously and critically, rather than being unconsciously formed by them. Technology provides a clear example of this challenge. Smartphones, social media, streaming entertainment, and the internet offer remarkable benefits and can be used for genuine good. Yet their design often exploits psychological vulnerabilities, creating addictive usage patterns that fragment attention, foster comparison, and prevent the kind of deep presence needed for prayer, contemplation, and meaningful relationships. From an Ignatian perspective, these tools require specific discernment and intentional boundaries if they are not to become unconscious battlegrounds where spiritual defeats occur without our awareness. Similarly, our culture's approach to success, achievement, and social status often runs directly counter to the values of the gospel. The pursuit of wealth, comfort, security, and recognition can become so normalized that we fail to recognize how these priorities might be shaping our fundamental life choices away from God's purposes. The Ignatian meditation on the two standards helps us recognize these cultural forces as part of the spiritual battle, calling us to conscious resistance and counter-cultural choices when necessary. Even within religious contexts, spiritual warfare continues in subtle forms. Religious pride, judgmentalism, tribalism, and the reduction of faith to mere external observances are temptations that Ignatius would readily recognize. The enemy of our spiritual progress often works not by turning us away from religion entirely, but by distorting our practice of it in ways that ultimately separate us from authentic relationship with God and compassionate connection with others. Maintaining spiritual vigilance means examining not just whether we are religious, but how we are religious. How might we apply Ignatian wisdom about spiritual battle to our lives today? If you find yourself in a season of spiritual dryness or desolation, remember Ignatius's counsel not to make major changes, not to abandon spiritual practices, and to trust that this season serves a purpose in your spiritual formation. Consider whether this desolation might be connected to genuine spiritual growth that has provoked increased opposition. Use this challenging time to purify your motivations and deepen your commitment beyond emotional experiences. If you are experiencing spiritual consolation with its accompanying fervor, enthusiasm, and emotional connection to God, receive these gifts with gratitude, but maintain humility. Remember that these feelings, while genuine, are given not as rewards for spiritual achievement, but as encouragement for the journey ahead. Use this favorable time to form resolutions and gain insights that will sustain you when more challenging seasons arrive, as they inevitably will. For all of us, regardless of our current spiritual season, Ignatius would recommend regular practice of the exam, that daily review of consciousness that helps us recognize the subtle movements of different spirits in our experience. This simple practice, taking just 10-15 minutes typically at the end of the day, helps develop our spiritual sensitivity and discernment. We begin by thanking God for blessings received, then ask for light to see our day clearly. We review the day's events and our responses to them, noticing where we felt drawn toward or away from God. We ask forgiveness for failures and resolve to grow. This regular practice over time develops our capacity to recognize and respond wisely to spiritual influences. Ignatius would also counsel us to seek spiritual direction or companions for the journey. The spiritual battle is not meant to be fought alone. By sharing our experiences with trusted guides or friends, we gain perspective, insight, and support that is essential for spiritual growth. This vulnerability runs counter to our individualistic culture, but represents ancient wisdom about how genuine spiritual formation occurs within community, not in isolation. If you find these reflections on Ignatius and spiritual battle resonating with your own experience, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, where we'll continue exploring these timeless insights for contemporary spiritual life. Each week we delve into the wisdom of the saints and spiritual masters, translating their teachings into practical guidance for our daily lives. You're not alone in seeking a faith that goes beyond surface religiosity to authentic transformation. By subscribing, you'll join a community of fellow pilgrims walking this path of deeper spiritual awareness. I'm grateful for your presence here today. Your willingness to engage these challenging truths is itself a sign of the Spirit's work in your life. As we draw our exploration to a close, let us remember that the spiritual battle Ignatius describes is ultimately not about grim duty or fearful vigilance, but about love. The combat we engage is for the freedom to love authentically and completely, without the distortions and limitations that sin and deception impose upon us. In the meditation that concludes his spiritual exercises, Ignatius invites us to consider how God dwells in all created things, giving them existence, empowering their activity, laboring on our behalf in everything around us. The universe itself is saturated with divine presence and love. Our awareness of spiritual battle then leads not to paranoia, but to greater freedom and joy. By recognizing the forces that would limit our capacity to receive and give love, we can cooperate more fully with grace working in us and around us. We can live with greater intentionality, purpose, and authenticity in every dimension of our experience. This awareness, far from burdening us, liberates us to engage life with full consciousness and genuine freedom. Saint Ignatius himself exemplifies this integration of spiritual combat and joyful service. Despite the austerities of his early conversion and the rigorous self-discipline he maintained throughout his life, contemporaries described him as remarkably cheerful, gracious, and pleasant to be around. His letters often overflow with expressions of joy and gratitude. His spiritual battle did not make him grim or rigid, but increasingly free to love God and others with generosity and creativity. So too can our engagement with spiritual combat following Ignatian wisdom lead not to heaviness, but to lightness of spirit, not to fearful self-protection, but to courageous self-giving, not to rigid perfectionism, but to humble and joyful service. Those who sleep with faith may indeed wake up in spiritual battle, but it is a battle worth fighting, a combat that leads to authentic freedom and ultimate fulfillment of our deepest human potential. As you move forward from this reflection, I invite you to notice the spiritual movements within your own experience, the subtle pulls toward and away from God, the interior voices that either encourage or discourage your spiritual growth. Begin to recognize these not merely as random thoughts or feelings, but as significant indicators of spiritual influences at work. Let this awareness not burden you, but awaken you to the meaningful drama in which you participate each day. a drama with eternal significance and profound personal implications. Remember the words of Ignatius himself, who said, "Few souls understand what God would accomplish in them if they were to abandon themselves unreservedly to Him, and if they were to allow His grace to mold them accordingly." This abandonment, this trust, this cooperation with divine grace becomes possible in a new way when we recognize the spiritual battle that surrounds us. No longer fighting blindfolded, we can engage with wisdom, discernment, and confident hope, knowing that though the combat is real, the victory is assured through the one who has already conquered and who fights alongside us and within us each day. Those who sleep with faith wake up in spiritual battle, but they also wake up accompanied, equipped, empowered, and already participating in an ultimate victory that nothing can overturn. This is the paradoxical wisdom that Saint Ignatius offers us, a vision of spiritual life that is both sobering and deeply hopeful, challenging and profoundly liberating. May we receive this wisdom with gratitude and allow it to transform not only our understanding, but our daily choices, our relationships, and our fundamental orientation toward the God who calls us to this noble combat and offers us the grace to prevail.